focus on EU energy and climate policy within this presentation. And it's called Devising Policy Amidst Complexity. So the summary of this is that at the centre of sort of any piece of research that you do is usually some kind of puzzle. And the puzzle here is really over mid to late part of the last decade, sort of 2005 to 2010, a really extreme deterioration in energy relations between the EU and Russia. And from today, looking back, you might think, well, yeah, I mean, it's obvious those guys don't get on energy, but in the middle, around 2005, the West and the EU as part of that, and Russia were having quite a nice, thank you very much, energy relationship. And in fact, it had been going increasingly positively, particularly for the EU side of it. So from today, looking back, this doesn't look very surprising, this deterioration, but at the time it actually was. So that's sort of the puzzle that's at the centre of the presentation. And a lot of the analysis focuses the analytical lens on Russia and says that Russians have done a bunch of things, and those things are all completely wrong, and that's why the relationship has deteriorated. And so I've said, well, let's have a look at the EU and try and consider some of their part of this deterioration in the relationship. So I'm focusing the lens back onto the EU, looking particularly at how it approaches energy in order to provide some different explanations. So I'm sort of working also here within a literature and trying to provide some different explanations to what is out there in the literature. So I outline 4 different frameworks of ideas about energy within the EU and how it should be governed. And then I assess the ways in which there is what I would describe as a proliferation of legitimate, and this is the really important word, frameworks of ideas about energy and how this has impacted upon that relationship. So this is the puzzle at the start. So in the 1990s, as everybody knows, Russia came in from the Cold. So the Cold War ended, the Soviet Union was dismantled and disaggregated into obviously separate countries that we know today. And during this period, there was a lot of what we call policy transfer from Western governments and other Western institutions to Russia and other ex-Soviet Union countries. And there was an assumption within all of this that the West had won the Cold War, and it was the ideas of market liberalism that had won, really, and other ideas such as communism were discredited, in the garbage bin, and you no longer needed to worry about them anymore. So this is what has, this is the context within which all of this happens. And I mean, there was some really direct policy transfer going on at this time. You had people from US universities, I mean, very, very highly accredited professors from Harvard and places like that going across to Russia and advising things like shock therapy, which was to privatize and liberalize the vast Russian economy, but so quickly that people wouldn't have any time to do anything other than get on with it and adapt to their new circumstances. So when we talk about policy transfer, this is real. This isn't just sort of some notional thing. There was real policy transfer going on. And the EU was very much part of that process. And within that, one of the important relationships recognised between the EU and Russia was this energy relationship, because all through the Cold War, Russia was exporting energy, gas, but also oil to Europe. So, despite this intense ideological dispute, this flow of energy was ongoing from Russia into Europe. During that period, Europe had a lot more of its own energy, so it wasn't quite as dependent as it is now. And so then in the 1990s, as Russia comes in from the cold and starts to liberalise and privatise, albeit not in the manner exactly, I would say, that the West would have liked to see, but they were going through a process of liberalisation and privatisation. And as a result of that, Russia was increasingly seen as a very reliable fossil fuel supplier within this interdependent relationship. So there was a lot positive that was going on, and Russia were also agreeing to sign something called an Energy Charter Treaty between the EU and Russia. And that was a charter treaty that really put into some sort of legal frame, a bit like the GATT. I don't know if you're aware of the GATT framework, but it was very similar to the GATT framework. So Russia actually did agree to sign this process, but didn't actually ultimately ratify it. So that's the 1990s. So then we get on to the mid-2000s, which is the period that the paper really relates to. And you have a load of things going on here. And the first sign that Russia was maybe reversing its direction a bit was when Khodorkovsky, who was the CEO of this big company, very big company, oligarch, called Yukos, was arrested on fraud charges. He was imprisoned, and various Yukos assets were seized and then auctioned off and bought by a Russian state energy company. You had new rulings on foreign investment, restricting foreign investment into Russian energy companies. The Energy Charter Treaty, Russia announced they would not ratify it. There were other broader negotiations called the Partnership and Cooperation Agreements, and negotiation within those agreements really stalled. And then you have these sort of, at the time, very high profile two gas transit disputes between the Ukraine and Russia, which had a big impact on Europe. So now Russia goes from this really reliable, interdependent relationship, and they send their energy and we pay them money and send them a whole load of rules and policies and regulations while we're at it. It goes from that to this increasingly understood Russia as unreliable. It's geopolitical, it's resource nationalist, we're having all these terms being thrown at Russia, but clearly with the inference that Russia is the wrongdoer. And in some research, as we'll probably see on the next slide, and some analysis on this, what you get is that you've got this EU energy here, which is very much based on market liberal rules, and underpinning all of that, really since the end of World War II, had been this notion that you could build a peace based on these liberal market rules, getting everyone signing up to these rules. So you have this really nice EU here against this Russia as geopolitical and nationalist, and just coming together, and this is how people were explaining the relationship. And so the balance of the relationship also changes. And so the context changes again. So instead of the notion that the end of history, or the end of ideological history, has been reached, which was what Fukuyama's argument was at the time, although he stepped back from that argument. So instead of the idea that there is no question really about what our ideas should be, you have this new notion that people are writing about, 2006 sort of onwards, that this whole idea of the West, or the US in particular, but also the EU being a soft power based on knowledge authority, and having a claim over knowledge authority, i.e. the idea that market liberal ideas are proven to work and all the others are rubbish, is being challenged by decisions in various BRICS countries, not just Russia, but also in Russia. So you have a new context that's emerging. But you have various observations here about this relationship between the EU and Russia. One is that the EU, which had been increasingly described as a normative power, has increasingly less influence over Russia. That within the Putin era, Russia has changed its mind about being a taker of EU rules based on market liberal ideas. The notion that Moscow is in the driving seat, that energy is now so Russia is some sort of energy superpower. I mean, and this change was really quick, because sort of still late 90s, early 2000s, Russia was seen as this very developing state that needed the West's help kind of thing. And then within years, suddenly, they're no longer a developing state that needs the West's help, they're an energy superpower. And this happened quite quickly. And then you get these concerns, I mean, really loudly shouted from the rooftops in the media, but also in political circles, concerns about being dependent on Russia for fossil fuels. And then you have some interpretations of why this was happening. And one which I've obviously referred to already is that the EU is following the correct market liberal path, but Russia is deviant from this path. Point number one. And then point number two for some people was, okay, well they've deviated from the path, but what will happen is that the markets will punish Russia for doing this, and they will have to come back to the market liberal path. I mean, I was conducting interviews in the Foreign Office around this time, and they were like toys out of the pram, really cross with Russia, sending delegations to Russia to tell them that what they were doing was wrong, and that they needed to liberalise, and then things would get better. But then also saying things like, well, the markets will punish them, people will disinvest, and Russia will be forced to come back to the market liberal path. So other interpretations, to take one step further, was that what Russia was doing, their actions in terms of energy governance, were jeopardising the liberalisation of energy markets, and therefore also jeopardising energy security. And another last interpretation here was that the EU has been too divided in energy, but it must now act in solidarity, so you get this word solidarity constantly, to improve its negotiating position with Russia. Now already in what I've said so far, you have the notion that ideas, or frameworks or ideas, some people call them paradigms of ideas, but that ideas are important to governance. And my research is very much based within a very broad political science group of work that tries to use ideas as explanatory variables. So trying to look beyond interests in order to understand motivations for decisions, but also understand what kinds of structures are in place and why those structures are in place. So this research holds ideas to be important. And it also rests on a notion of politics as collective action, as having authority, and finding the best story to fit within any given socioeconomic context, which is a bit of sort of a long way of saying that politics is about collective action, but is constantly changing in terms of how it manifests itself. And so the next supposition that you have to make from this perspective is that ideas directly relate to policy and to the process of decision-making in policy. How do you make decisions? And what it argues is that understandings of any issue area, be it health, be it monetary policy, be it energy policy, be it climate policy, your understanding of that issue area and how it should be governed can be informed by paradigms or sets of ideas. The how it should be governed question then relates to questions like the objectives. What is the objective of having a policy in this policy area? And I'm going to come back to these in the next few slides so you can see it a bit more substantively. What kind of instruments should you have to solve your problem in the policy area? What kind of markets or other institutions should you create in order to govern a policy area? And then another notion is that what happens with certain sets of ideas that are credible is that they get embedded within institutions. So they're then embedded within the rules that you pursue, the norms, either formal or informal, that you go by, the regulations that are put in place. And so if that is the case, and obviously there's a lot of literature that argues that it is, then credible ideas that have become embedded, and you see a lot of literature that talks about the degree to which neoliberal economic ideas have been embedded within Western institutions over the last 20 or maybe 30 years. When these ideas become embedded, because they then become quite difficult to change, they confer quite a lot of power on certain institutions or certain countries. And that's why people talk about soft power, because what they're saying is, if you're the EU and you were in a negotiating room in the 1990s with Russia, you can say, well, actually, our ideas work because we're all really rich and our economies are growing and we're doing well, and you lost the Cold War. Your ideas are clearly not very good. Thereby, we have knowledge authority, and you can't really argue against us. And the beauty, of course, of the neoliberal economic ideas in particular is that they are, or have become over time, incredibly complex, and they have certain methodologies that are associated with them, so then they become quite hard to disprove. Because if you're not using the same methodology as me, it's quite hard to disprove my set of ideas. So this is the idea that they are associated with power, and that's why in a lot of texts you see this notion of soft power, or knowledge, authority, those kinds of things. Now, as if that wasn't all complicated enough already, there is a notion, which is the area that I've worked in a lot actually, that ideas can also be important if you're looking for change. They're important so that you can contest things. Alternative ideas can do things like claim a crisis exists, like, for example, maybe a climate crisis or an energy security crisis, that kind of thing. So they can claim that there are problems and that there are policy failures associated with those problems. And so then you offer, a different set of ideas can offer a reinterpretation of what an issue area is, or a policy area is, or what a problem is. And then if your ideas pass the credibility test, which is, of course, the big test, then you can suggest solutions related to that interpretation. And now, I hope that wasn't too complicated, but on the next slides, hopefully, are going to sort of build on that, but specifically with relation to EU energy policy. So as I said at the start, instead of just looking at Russia and what they've done wrong, I'm looking also at EU energy policy within the context of this relationship. And notions of wrong and right, for me, don't work very well, because for a lot of people it's just a question of perspective. What perspective are you coming from? Where do you live? What's your context? So for me already the literature that says Russia's wrong and the EU is right is completely oversimplifying the situation. So I'm just talking here in terms of perspectives. I was trying to shoot me for saying that. So here what we have, and I'm really terrible at diagrams, so I'm sorry it's not very sophisticated, but here I've got EU energy policy and this notion of unbundling, of integrating markets, but also of acting together as the EU rather than just being 27 different member states. So here's EU energy policy, and what I'm saying is that not only do you have this market liberal bias within EU energy policy, which was in the driving seat, in terms of direction through the 1990s. Now you've got a bunch of other sets of ideas about energy and how it should be governed that are vying with market liberal ideas for influence, and actually increasingly successfully. Geopolitics, the whole sort of, energy security / geopolitics set of ideas, climate mitigation and adaptation, of course. You may be obviously more familiar with that. But then also this sort of notion of industrial policy, particularly at the member state level, is very important. So here we have two frameworks of ideas about energy and how it should be governed. And this set here is market liberal, and this set here is what I've loosely termed industrial policy. And so they suggest different interpretations of what the policy area is. So what is the point of energy? What does it do in society? They suggest different objectives for energy policy. And then they suggest different governance strategies and different instruments that you might be able to use to pursue your policy. So market liberal ideas underpin or go with the notion that actually, at the end of the day, energy is just tradable commodities, service sectors of the economy. It has low intrinsic value, so low value in its own right because they're replaceable and tradable, and you don't really place too much emphasis on it. You would just treat it like you would any other sector of the economy. Policy objectives around this have been the creation of competitive and transparent markets, Economic efficiency is very important, free trade between countries, and the integration of interdependent markets, sort of this idea of the back and forth and the relationship upon one another being very important. And then the strategies that have been pursued have been liberalisation, privatisation to maybe a slightly lesser degree, although obviously in the UK privatisation has been very important, but really liberalisation has been important. Market liberal norm diffusion, which is a fancy way of saying policy transfer. We're going to sign a treaty with you, and as part of signing that treaty you have to agree to pursue these market liberal norms. And the establishment of multilateral institutions. So I don't know if you're familiar with the arguments that institutions like the World Bank and the IMF have been heavily influenced by market liberal ideas. And then when, say, the World Bank goes to lend you some money, the condition for you getting the money is that you implement some market liberal rules. And so industrial policy is saying some pretty different stuff about energy and what its socio-economic role or its role in society is. It's saying that energy is incredibly important to industrial growth. This is the big China argument at the moment. I mean, their argument is that we're going to get energy through bilateral deals, obviously through big state energy companies, because actually it's incredibly important to their industrial growth. So you're really emphasising the value of energy within your economy. And energy industry is obviously important as employers as well. So what you want to do in terms of the objective of your energy policy is to protect nascent and or important national industries from competition. So you're no longer building these competitive markets. You want to protect from competition while you build up these industries, at least in the beginning. And then your government strategies, direct state form in the form of support, in the form of subsidies, tariffs, tax breaks, that kind of thing. And at the national level, a member state level within Europe, you do see a fair amount of this going on. So some people refer to French energy policy as being sort of quite a big example of that in action, particularly with regard to the nuclear industry. This is just sort of a brief history, because in the 1990s, when the EU was trying to do its marketisation programme, the real fight was with the member states in terms of the kickback against the policies. So you had this negotiating process that was ongoing between the Commission, and actually in particular the Competition Commission was really driving a lot of this policy during the 1990s. So seeking integration within Europe based on liberalisation and privatisation, mainly liberalisation, but many member states kicking back, saying actually we want to protect certain industries or certain national champions, as like coal companies, nuclear in France. And there was an ongoing and still is opposition to giving up sovereignty over decisions which affect either the whole of your energy sector or certain energy sectors. And obviously the notion that economic growth is central within that. But despite this back and forth argument between the EU level and member state level, the direction was clearly market liberal for quite a long time. So the EU identity forged post-World War II was the pursuit of peace via liberal, rules-based international order, a rejection of the kinds of power politics that are implicit in that industrial policy approach to things. The electricity and gas directives, obviously about liberalisation and unbundling. And in terms of international energy relations, including with Russia, they were based on extending European rules-based energy markets and trade, and also measures of good governance that organisations like the IEA would then monitor against. And then you have two more sets of ideas about energy and how it should be governed that I argue are increasingly influential. And the landscape at the EU level is changing because it's not really just the competition anymore. You have, DG Environment was kind of involved for a bit, but now you have new institutions which are DG Environment, you have DG Climate as a new institution since 2010, and DG Energy as a new institution. So even the landscape of institutions at the EU level that is making decisions is already changing and becoming much more complex. And questions about how those institutions talk to one another, I think, would be very interesting to pursue in terms of level of agreement, in terms of how to proceed going forward. So again, we have here, what's the role of energy in society. Here you have what policy objectives would be from that perspective, and what governance instruments you might pursue. Climate, clearly energy use is an emitter of carbon dioxide emissions. So obviously energy is important, but it is an emitter. Fossil fuels are an emitter of carbon dioxide emissions. Your objective is to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, but also to pursue more energy from renewable sources and energy efficiency. And then you have a range of other governance instruments that you want to use. But here, energy as a policy area becomes, if done correctly, a vehicle to achieve these objectives, reduction of carbon dioxide emissions and energy from renewables. And that's a completely different function for energy policy than if you have an energy policy that's there in order to create competitive markets, or a policy that's there in order to pursue energy security on its own. Clearly, there have been a lot of arguments that there needs to be greater state involvement in energy markets in order to get these objectives up and running. And then your geopolitical is kind of related to industrial policy in some senses, but there's much more of a focus on the international aspects. So energy is, from this perspective, a strategic asset of national importance, sometimes referred to as the lifeblood of modern economies. Energy is conferring power, so if you're a big producer, that means that you can be geopolitically powerful from this perspective. Your objectives are above all secure and reliable supply, and that obviously also for energy producers means secure and reliable demand for your product, so it's not just about supply. Sovereign control over energy for some countries is very important from a geopolitical standpoint, and you're thinking more about independence than you are about interdependence from this, or the ability to be independent. And again, notions of more direct state involvement, of bilateral over multilateral agreements, national control of energy assets, but also the notion of solidarity, which is used in a couple of ways, either solidarity at the national level, or the EU has tried to use the notion of solidarity at the EU level. So this is just some of the ways in which you see the EU talking in these different kinds of ways, depending on who's doing the talking, and sometimes depending on who their audience is. But in the paper there are a lot more examples of this kind of thing, which to me is kind of contradictory. But, and it is when you put it all together in one paper, then you can sort of see how they contradict each other. But these are different people talking at different points in time to different audiences. So from the market liberal perspective, you can read documents that say that the EU energy market depends on free and transparent markets. This is this interdependency idea. That the internal energy market has not achieved its potential for transparency, accessibility and choice. There are barriers still to open and fair competition, and when they're saying things like that, they normally mean countries like Russia. And then you get this notion that energy is just this series of commodities that are interchangeable and can be tradable and of less significance, which is nicely, from the same mouth, contrasted, which is what I would call a much more geopolitical interpretation, which is that energy is the lifeblood of our society. We are also technologically embedded. We have to plug our mobiles in, we have to plug our laptops in, we have to plug our tellies in, we have to travel, etc., etc., etc. So now, instead of this being the sort of tradable thing that's not so important, it's, oh, actually it's the lifeblood of our societies. And then from the geopolitical perspective, you see energy as a strategically important area of cooperation. So suddenly it's strategically important, not something that should be left to the markets to decide. And then climate, you see obviously some pretty different perspectives on that. Calls and some of the EU documentation for a post-industrial revolution in order to pursue convincingly climate change mitigation. And then just another quick quote here, needs to increase energy efficiency worldwide and for a quantum leap in renewable and low carbon energy. So this is all sort of within EU level energy policy. And so now I've got 4 more slides before you all fall asleep on why this is important, and particularly for this energy relationship. So I would argue that we can use this previously quite embedded or dominant market liberal perspective to explain the deterioration in relations. So from the EU perspective, as you would read them or writing documents or narrating to media outlets or whatever it is, from this perspective, the resource nationalism in Russia, but also China and sometimes India, is wrong, because that's just not how you would go about things if you are trying to manage or govern energy efficiently. Energy security from a market liberal perspective isn't just an objective of energy policy. Like, we're all familiar with the trilemma now, and energy security is part of that trilemma. But from a market liberal perspective, it's actually an outcome of liberalisation, privatisation, and freely trading transparent international markets. So if you get that first, if you create that first, then you will get energy security. So it's more of an outcome of those processes rather than an objective in and of itself. So from that perspective, state interference in markets results in energy supply insecurity. Hence, there was so much worry and concern in that sort of 2005 to 2010 period about supply insecurity. And also from that perspective, state-owned companies are, by the very fact that they are state-owned from a market liberal perspective, that would make them inefficient. It would result in bad investment choices, and that would ultimately disturb markets. So you can really see that if you are thinking through those lenses, if you put that pair of your market liberal glasses on, you can really see why you would interpret what was going on as quite scary in many regards. And so once you've had your sort of 10 or 20 years, it didn't last that long, of market liberal knowledge authority, say, it then becomes quite difficult to adjust. So we're the EU, and we thought we were right for 20 years, and we've told everybody else that we were right, and we've embedded these ideas in our institutions. But now, so maybe we're not right, so do we have to adjust? I mean, these things are very difficult to do when you're thinking about the complexity of these institutions. So it becomes difficult to adjust to Russia as both capable and determined to negotiate on its own terms. And then the EU had, I would argue, to an extent disengaged with political perspectives that inform decision-making in some producer states. And by that I mean that they had so sort of, rejected the notion that there are other ways of thinking about, economic relations, and within that, energy relations, that they just hadn't really bothered to do much research on it. And so it had become rather what I would call depoliticized, but they were pretty uninformed. So the second reason why I think that this sets of ideas are important is that geopolitics, although it sort of became more obviously talked about, a more obvious narrative at the EU level during this time period. What I thought was quite ironic, really, is that there are quite a lot of geopolitical ideas that are ingrained within Western institutions, but they were there, but sort of somehow taken for granted. And one of these is the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas, which extends, it allows states to exercise sovereign rights over subsoil assets within a 200-mile barrier of the border of your country. And that's geography, where are your borders, who has access, who has rights, who has sovereignty. And that is built into the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And within GATT, earlier I was talking about the Energy Charter Treaty, and the reason that there was a need to have that is because GATT rules, trade rules, exempted natural resource sectors. So the reason why it was possible for Saudi Arabia to join GATT is not because they wanted energy to trade under market rules, but because they had exemptions for resources. So there were some of these ideas built into Western institutions also. And within the EU more recently, differences between with the extension of the EU eastwards to include a lot of ex-Soviet countries, there are a lot of differences between older EU partners and East European understandings of energy and Russia. And for a lot of the new members of the EU is being seen as a vehicle to correct power imbalances in terms of relations between smaller countries and Russia. And the real sort of pushers of this kind of notion, particularly Poland, but also Lithuania. So for them, this relationship, EU and Russia, was about playing power politics, but not really necessarily about market integration. If that's what they had to do in order to get the power balance back in their favour, then they do it, but really it was about power relationships. Also in terms of geopolitics, it's interesting that although the EU was working very hard at putting together a solidarity and a single EU foreign energy policy that would be used to deal with Russia, plenty of countries were signing bilateral deals with Russia at the same time, so Italy, Germany, and some other smaller countries. And then in terms of geopolitical EU, the Nabucco pipeline project, which isn't actually, funnily enough, going to go ahead now. But for a long time there was this idea that although the EU were, in terms of their negotiations with Russia, they were talking about interdependence and two-way and relying on one another and all of this kind of stuff, the EU were politically and financially directly supporting a new pipeline project that would allow gas to come into Europe without having to go through Russia, to bypass them completely. And in order to do that, it had to go quite a long way around, and it was economically completely unviable. So, you know, the EU would talk to Russia about leaving it up to the markets to decide, but then they were directly investing in this pipeline project. Ultimately, it didn't happen because it was such a difficult project to get off the ground, not least because it had to pass through countries that were in conflict with one another over various other issues. So it was never a straightforward project. But all of this to me suggests that there has been a growing degree of legitimacy, credibility in this geopolitical interpretation of energy. And how you, as the EU, accommodate that, how you recognise that without appearing hypocritical to external observers. So if you look at Russian newspapers and if you listen to Russian arguments about this situation, they'll say, well, the EU comes here and tells us to sign this ECT and tells us to implement all of these liberal market processes, but actually they are directly funding a pipeline that's going to bypass us. This is just hypocrisy. And you can see that you can make that argument quite easily. if you are Russia. It's pretty credible and easy to make that kind of argument. So they then use it back against the EU. Also, there's the question, and I think actually for some countries, energy security increasingly becomes about power politics and not about integration to create free trading markets. And there's obviously an implication for the ability of the EU to act in solidarity, given this much wider range of ideas about energy. So this third slide on why ideas have been important in terms of understanding this relationship and the deterioration in the relationship is that narratives emerged within media, academic and policy-making circles which directly appeal to geopolitical notions of energy supply as a subject for security and as energy as something that is under threat. And they appear to do so because they think that it is, I've put cognitively convincingly, but basically that means that it just is an argument that people, when they hear it, will understand. So within the EU, various groups of people appear to believe that Russia and energy can pose a genuine threat. So this argument doesn't fall on empty ears, it falls on ears that are actually hearing the argument and believing in it. So this stoked up fears of dependence on unreliable foreign supplies, and these fears were strategically then used by various bodies and various personnel at the EU level to argue for this energy solidarity, this energy foreign policy where the EU acts together as one group. So they were using these arguments, whether they believed them or not, in order to argue for solidarity. So there was a guy called Andres Piebalgs, who was an energy minister at the time of the first Russia-Ukraine gas transit dispute, which was, I think, 2006. And he sort of joked that it was really the best thing that happened to him as commissioner because it really highlighted the importance of energy and the importance of the EU acting together in solidarity on energy. And so then the argument came that member states must now speak with one voice in order to improve the EU's negotiating position with Russia and really within the changing world. And then sort of as a result of these fears and worries, energy is given an article within the EU, within the Lisbon Treaty for the first time. The DG Energy was created and a formal competence is given to the EU at the EU level for energy. So there's also this strategic appeal to geopolitical ideas about energy, arguably and conversely, so this is sort of slightly paradoxically, at the same time reinforces both Russia's claim to be an energy superpower, so you're reinforcing their claim by appealing to this kind of narrative to get what you want politically. But it also reinforces the need for sovereignty at the national level. So there were a lot of countries that thought, well, what we're going to do is concentrate on our national energy policy in this situation and our relationship with Russia, rather than wait for the EU to get its act together so that we have a foreign policy, so we act together as the EU. So that was very paradoxical in terms of an outcome. And then I've obviously raised this question already about, well, is solidarity then about market liberal governance and unbundling and integration, or is it around opposition to Russia and playing power politics? And then I've got one slide on climate change ideas and how this injects further complexity into this already pretty complex situation. And there are, in terms of the direct EU-Russia energy relationship, there were some positives here actually. Energy efficiency and learning in terms of energy efficiency, as well as some energy technology sharing, became one of the few areas that the EU and Russia could actually talk about in energy without there being doors slammed and people flouncing out of the room. So it did actually become an area where there were some agreements put in place and there was some progress in terms of the relationship. So it was seen as an area of much lower contestation, where Russia was still prepared to learn, as it were. But there's also the question of, in future, however, if there's going to be a greater percentage of EU supply from renewable energy, that would mean less dependence on Russia, and so the EU can feel less worried about dependence and less conflicted about this relationship. So this could serve to diffuse this politics of fear, or this politics of fear of dependency. So that was sort of kind of on the positive side. However, on the sort of slightly more complex side, if you're Russia and the EU is telling you, well, actually in the future we're going to have all our own renewables, so we're not going to need your energy at all anymore. And as Russia, what is of primary importance to you is security of demand for your principal product, which is quite a considerable part of your GDP in terms of exports of this product. This message that you're getting, that Europe isn't even going to need your product in the future, is pretty problematic, as you can imagine. So given that they're concerned about long-term security of demand, what Europe needs to do, however, is balance this sort of near-term, medium-term situation where you still want to import with this longer-term situation where you don't want the product anymore. And obviously, given, as we all understand, that investments in gas and oil are very long-term investments, you're not going to invest today if you think that your market's going to disappear in 20 years' time or 30 years' time. So I think that there's a real problem within the relationship, having brought in these climate change ideas at the EU level. And so you have these three pillars of EU energy policy, as they call it: so competitive, sustainable and secure energy. And I would suggest that that infers a very complex new set of interrelationships between what were previously either not areas of policy for the EU, or at least at the member state area they were discrete areas of policy. And so, some questions around that here. Are there trade-offs between these objectives of energy policy? And if there are, which objectives would be prioritised at such a point in time? And is the EU thinking about these questions of trade-offs? And given actually that a lot of the thinking behind competitive, sustainable and secure takes place in different DGs now, what kind of interaction is there? And are there contradictions inherent between climate ideas about achieving a low-carbon future and other approaches to understanding energy, i.e. your market-level approach or your industrial policy approach that we touched on earlier? And there is one more slide, which I'm probably not going to go into, but it really just talks about, why is it that people seem to think that it is credible that Russia can be an energy superpower, or that energy can confer power. So it just sort of asks some questions about those, and I'm not going to go into that here. But this is just the reference to the paper that a lot of these ideas are in, but obviously in a lot more detail than I could cover with you now. And that's the end, so if you've got any questions at all, I'll be very happy to take them. And just open up a discussion if you sort of want to, as a group. Years, or maybe one full-on year of delegations from the EU, cross people from the UK and the EU saying, you're not doing things correctly. And they were saying, that's it, we don't care. China's there, huge demand. Russia's kind of big, borders with a lot of other countries. So
it's quite easy to build.
Yeah, well, the pipelines to facilitate that are going to be really extensive investments. And when they first started talking about this, the EU and the UK said, nah, it'll be too expensive, they won't be able to afford it, and etc., etc. But they have got on with it, and there's one pipeline complete. In fact, it was going to go to Japan, and then they decided to reorient it towards China, which wasn't very popular with Japan. So, and there are issues between Japan and China in terms of energy relationships. But yeah, no, they're continuing to try and expand in that direction.
So in that sense, they're going to stay being an energy superpower, just in a slightly different dimension.
Well, I mean, I suppose kind of less so if your overall market is smaller. I mean, if you think of the negotiating position of these various countries, I know the guy who used to negotiate for Qatari National Oil and Gas, LNG, And he used to go to Asia and go, well, you guys want some LNG and this is going to be the price. And then he'd go to Europe and he'd go, well, you guys need some, this is obviously pre-shale gas. And he'd go, you guys, and then they just play them off. And so, but if you start reorienting considerably down one new path, then there's less people to play off against each other, I suppose. Well, unless China is incredibly successful at promoting its renewables and
They're doing quite well.
yeah, but they're still building loads of coal power stations.
I was wondering if in the end, the member states of the EU will agree to have like a foreign energy policy, like a whole organization with Russia or another country, because energy policy, it's a domain. Energy actually, it's a domain that every government wants to have the power and all to manipulate all
Yes,
things.
yeah.
So do you think that it will be impossible, like an institution in them to do that? We have seen through the years that the member states, they are arguing about several things. How about energy? It's a very important issue about each state.
Yeah.
So,
Well, it's a very good question. And what is slightly problematic for the EU is that although it does now have a formal competence in energy, which it didn't have before, so that is certainly a step towards achieving what you're talking about, an EU foreign policy. So they do have a competence now, but their real problem is that in the Lisbon Treaty, which gives them this competence, there's a get-out clause. I can't remember which article it is, it's like X, something. And the get-out clause says that, although we've given all these various competences at the EU level, this is not to question the sovereignty of member states in deciding over their energy mix, energy supply, and I think those are the two areas that are covered about the get-out clause. And I've spoken to people who look at this from a legal perspective, and they've said you could drive a tank through that. It is so open to interpretation that if you then actually sort of tried to implement through the courts, it would be very easy to argue. And then so that makes it much more complicated in order to achieve it. And and there are a lot of bilateral deals currently in place between various member states and Russia. So what happens to those deals if you're trying to establish this EU level? The Energy Charter Treaty was the closest that they got to it, and it was signed by two producers, Norway and Russia, but they neither ultimately ratified it. So I think that they're going to find that very difficult to do. And also maybe the moment of extreme fear and crisis on energy security is past, or for now anyway, and that's really what gave them, I think, the momentum to get the EU energy competence. So I think no.
yeah, me too.
Do you really believe that we can think about the EU's geopolitics, especially on energy geopolitics, without thinking US politics, especially in the Middle East? Because we are talking about the energy.
You mean the Caspian Basin particularly, or Middle Eastern?
Yeah, we can talk actually in Caspian and also Middle East, because in my opinion, it's hard to talk about the EU geopolitics without thinking US military intervention to Middle East, and also some, as we can see, the Afghanistan, also the Central Asia, because EU doesn't have any army to have a military action to protect its energy geopolitics.
Yes.
So they need some military power.
Yes.
And
the
US
EU
is
does
working-
act as that.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and the US is important in other respects because it is the global police person of oil trade. So it keeps various controversial straits open through military action if need be. And one of the big questions at the moment is, what if the US stops agreeing to do that? Because it's a pretty considerable outlay for them, pretty considerable expense. And countries like China, benefit from that because, you have this sort of protected trade. And the EU geopolitics is also, US geopolitics is also important because it has been allied with the EU and the UK specifically in a long history of geopolitical actions to access the supply that they wanted on the terms that they wanted. But I suppose just looking at the EU as I was in this paper, I was sort of trying to make the point that about a certain literature which was talking about these deterioration in relations and making it the other person's done something wrong, and trying to bring the critical lens back onto the EU and trying to show just the degree to which geopolitics, which weren't talked about for a good 10-year or so period, the way in which that is now implementing directly on policy decisions that were being made in energy, and how that looks for other people looking in, trying to reflect that back into the EU so that they could think about how that looks from abroad. But you're right, the geopolitics of oil and gas from the US side has been incredibly, for 100 years or incredibly important.
Because I know the
and they were building pipelines as well to try and go round people and all the rest of it.
Because I know the geopolitics concept is highly related with military because it's an old concept, isn't it?
Well,
it's
military is the method used
power,
to solve geopolitical problems.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Geopolitics is in its essence, it's to do with geography and where your borders are. So it also assumes the Westphalian state system.
Yeah.
So where your state boundaries are and recognition of those boundaries and recognition of the sovereign right to act within those boundaries are incredibly important to the geopolitical notion. So it is about more than military action. That just is a method that is then used in order to pursue your interests within that kind of mental framework.
Can I mention something about that? I mean, US, it's like an alliance with a lot of EU countries in NATO. So, in my point of view and what I know, what I believe, it's like, of course, US knows what is going on about energy in Europe and gives the okay, we can say, about what they are going to do through their diplomacies and several negotiations they're having. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose in a way I kind of see this maybe a little bit as the EU not having to bother thinking about it for so long because the US was doing that job.
Yeah.
And then suddenly, in geopolitical terms, it was right back on their boundary, especially as it was an extended EU to have included all these new member states. It became right back into their territory. And here, again, a geopolitical notion is a notion of backyards. And what you want to do if you're a geopolitical power is you want to make sure that your backyards are safe. And so for America, historically, the world has been, I suppose, their backyard, as it were. But for the EU, this became a moment where it became much more directly relevant. It required much more direct involvement and thinking and policy and action, and less just relying on what your friends over the water are thinking. Oh, sorry, Jess.
I just wanted to ask something about the kind of the soft power and knowledge authority that you're talking about, because I was at an event where Catherine spoke on energy security a while ago, and a very senior civil servant was very much talking about that as part of her role and of foreign officers' role, as kind of exporting this correct way or right way of doing things around the world. And I was quite surprised that was kind of how she was presenting things. Is that, in your experience, how kind of civil servants and policy elites still think, or are they also seeing that there's different ways of doing business that they need to adapt to?
Well, I mean, there's probably 3 answers to that question. and the first answer is that when you're on show for the Foreign Office and you're negotiating with someone, or you're getting the message out there about what it is that you do, that is the party line. That is the line that you toe. I've done some interviews in the Foreign Office where I've talked to absolute die-hard, that is the way the world works, or at least should work. But then I've also interviewed people who've gone, I've been trying to argue that we need to become more aware of other interpretations of either economic policy or energy policy or whatever it is, because clearly the rest of the world is not moving in the same direction that we want them to move in. But trying to argue against it internally for the few people that I've met has been incredibly difficult. So I mean, like civil servants are like anyone. I mean, there's different people believing different things. But arguing against it, I think, has been quite difficult. And again, if you remember the slide, I think the first slide, I was trying to get across the idea that if you've gone to school and then university and then you've been employed at a very high level to go and do a very high level civil service job, because you are the kind of person who has been educated in this way and you think that it is the right way, it's really hard to suddenly come slam up against something else and go, oh, now I've got to think completely differently. So what textbook do I read to do that? Where do I even start? So it is actually difficult to change, especially when it's embedded institutionally, the notion of how you operate, because it affects who you hire, what is the background of that person, what training do you give that person once they're in the institution. So that is why I think it is so embedded, but I think it's also so embedded because people don't know how else to think. There's no other set, here's your, actually let's just bring in the new set of rules, here they are. Now you need to sort of think differently, read that book kind of thing. I don't think there is a new set of rules yet. Very depressing.
So any of this being played out in what's going on in the Ukraine at the moment, or is that?
Oh yeah, completely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously you had the gas transit disputes, and geopolitics does play into that because pipelines are physical things and they pass across national boundaries, and for every national boundary that you pass across, you have to have a set of agreements in place that says, yes, you may pass here with your pipeline and these are the terms of trade and this is how it's all going to work. So you have all of that going on, but then within the Ukraine, you have an almost 50-50 split. It's a bit like Republicans and Democrats in the United States. You've got the Russia side and you've got the EU side. And the EU side adamantly wants to go forward with the EU, and the Russia side wants to go forward with Russia. So you have a really, really difficult split because it is so evenly split, actually, within the Ukraine. So a lot of that is playing on. And I suppose Ukraine has got the additional problem that because that relationship has been so problematic, Russia has gone north with Nord Stream, so that's a route into Europe without going through the Ukraine, and then there's sort of various new south pipelines coming on to buy. So it's not it used to be 90% of what came into Europe had to come in through the Ukraine, but it's going to be much less so in future. But yeah, definitely.
Can I just ask, I know this is a really silly question, but when Europe wanted to take over go from the 15 up to the 25, that was really because they just wanted to strengthen Europe and bring in these kind of communist